스타트업이 반드시 알아야 할 탑5 글로벌 진출 전략이라는 주제로 핀다의 이혜민 대표님 그리고 10X 이노베이션 랩 클라우스 비헤이지 CEO님 두 분 모시고 진행해 보겠습니다. 진행은 1대1 방식의 그 Fireside 챗 형식으로 진행이 되는 예정인데요. 두 분의 패널을 무대 위로 모셔보겠습니다. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 저는 이제 모더레이터이신 이혜민 핀다 대표님께 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다.
와우. 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 핀다 이혜민입니다. Welcome to COMEUP 2022, and thank you very much for joining us. And we're talking about how to have some global mindset and how to make our company more globally. So I think many Korean startups they want to make some their business in globally. So this session will be very helpful for even for me and also for many entrepreneurs in here. So I would like to introduce Klaus Wehage, who is the author of the global class. So Klaus, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Klaus. I am originally from Denmark, a small country in the Nordic, 6 million people. I've lived and worked on 4 different continents in Santiago, Chile. She's also lived there. Hanoi, Vietnam, from Denmark, and now in Silicon Valley. And I run an accelerator called 10X Innovation Lab in Silicon Valley, where we work with founders and entrepreneurs from across the world. And typically how we do that is actually partnering with governments and corporates to launch these programs in training founders on how to build, but also how to scale the companies internationally. And then more recently, we wrote a book on this topic because we discovered founders constantly made the same mistakes. And we were like, why does this keep happening? Why do they make these mistakes? Are there not any resources out there? And we found that there is, but it's very fragmented. And we had this crazy idea to think about writing a book and see if we could consolidate insights from executives that has lived the experience. And the book came out 2 months ago, and it became a Wall Street Journal and national bestseller in the US.
Wow. So thank you. And I've heard that you have business trip for 2.5 weeks, from Singapore, Portugal to Korea, right?
Right. Yeah.
Wow, so you have a very global schedule. Yeah.
Yes, and if I look a little bit tired, that's probably the reason why. So my hair is a little bit longer than usual. Usually I want to cut my hair a little bit and trim it a little bit before conferences, but didn't happen for this conference.
So my first question is, how did you get global perspective? And you already mentioned you have experience in the 4 continents.
Right.
So how did you get some global experience?
Right.
So I'm very curious your personal story.
Sure. I mean, I think fundamentally it comes through curiosity. And I remember back in the day when I was younger, around 9 or 10 years old, I was watching MTV back in Denmark at my mother's house, and I dreamt of going to the beaches in California and everything. So I always had that desire and that curiosity to build an international career. But in terms of having that global mindset, it comes through lived experiences. It comes through the experience of living in Chile, in Hanoi, etc., and now Silicon Valley in the US. And you can only learn and get this cultural mindset by doing that. And just to share a little bit of a story, when I was in Chile, I ended up staying with this family for about 4 weeks. And back in Denmark, I had gotten a lot of history lessons and everything around dictatorship and Pinochet. He's a very famous dictator in Latin America. And he's not here. He's dead, fortunately. So he's a very bad person. But I ended up staying with this family, and I saw basically on the pictures in this family's home that the mother was kissing this dictator's cheek on pictures all over the walls. She was a big fan of this guy. And originally I got this I didn't know how to react to that because I had gotten, obviously, the education that he was not a good human being and everything. But instead of actually judging that family, I decided just to stay with the family and try to listen and learn and understand why obviously they make these decisions in this cultural environment and so forth. So that's where I really learned a little bit of my cultural empathy and try to gain understanding of obviously the culture locally and so forth. Yeah.
Wow. So, so I have a very like a short like a global experience when I ran the business like my third company, which is called Noom.
Right.
So because like Noom's headquarters is in New York and my team, entire team is in like Asia, and
Right.
then we run the same product but making all the like besides products. Everything is all we make some like localization. So at that time, through that experience for 3 years, I've learned how to make some like a global like business operation, and also how to make some team globally and how
Right.
to manage all the things. But even I think that if I read this book earlier before I run the Noom,
Right.
it is more like I have some like more secret recipe to make less mistakes,
Right.
as you mentioned. So. From the COMEUP like a stage, they prepare some very great question for me. So
Right.
I would like to, make some this question to you.
Sure.
So, like how global like giants like Meta, Meta is a Facebook, yeah, and then the Uber. They like most early stage setups consider global expansion when they finally get to the scale-up phase rather than considering it from the very beginning. So global expansion is not the first thing that comes to mind when it is so difficult to have a certainty about one business model, right? So, but not to mention all the procedures and paperwork to secure like a funding and make MVP.
Right.
So do you agree that global scale up should come later, or do you think it has all the reasons to be considered from the beginning?
Right. Well, it obviously depends in terms of when you should expand and scale, and it's very situational, to be honest. And we write in the book, it often depends on also where you're from. Because in Denmark, it's a small country. You have to scale earlier than, for example, in the US. So Danish companies already look abroad around Series A, whereas in Silicon Valley, they look at it at late Series C and Series D. But to share a couple of examples of companies and founders that actually expanded early on is Zendesk. I don't know if you know, Zendesk is a known customer service platform. The founders chose the US as the first initial market to scale in. It was in Denmark, they developed the product there, but they quickly discovered that there's not a big appetite for SaaS platforms in Denmark, and that was more mature in the US. For those reasons, they actually came here. Vivino is another company which is a wine app. They chose California, San Francisco because there's a big wine industry, and early adoption around apps and so forth was also attractive there as well. So you can decide to do it very, very early on. You can also decide to do it later. What we then say is that it can also be a risk to do it too late, because then you start to hard code your business around that local market. And that's the tendency that we see a little bit with Korean businesses, that they hard code the business around this market. They tend to scale up to Series C, Series D. They basically build an organization that's very Korean. And then once you decide to go international, it's extremely difficult. I actually had a meeting, I'm not going to say the name, recently that has raised several hundreds millions of dollars in Korea. Very successful. The leadership team is incredibly globally minded, but the rest of the organization is very Korean. And I actually asked them, so how many languages do you speak at the office, or can you speak at the office? And they kind of smiled a little bit and giggled and say, maybe 3 languages. And it's around 600 people organization. And to me, that sounds a little bit like it's going to be a struggle when they then want to expand to new markets. Whereas if you compare it to Canva, which is a known platform used worldwide, their first 300 employees before the pandemic at the office, they spoke 70 different languages. 70, not 17. And so clearly that the founder, Melanie Perkins, has had a very global mindset and intentionally built the organization for international scale. A Danish example is a company called Pleo, which is a fintech company. The first 21 hires, they spoke around 17 different languages. So in my opinion, I think it's important to think global early, because that will impact the way you build your product, your team, your culture, structures and processes that can then support that scale. And I had a also a conversation, I think it was yesterday, with a great friend of mine from India. I also asked him about like Indian companies, how do they think about these things? They think India first, and by and large, and so there is a tendency to obviously hardcode the business around the Indian market, which obviously is great. It's a massive market and you can do so, but if you have the aspiration and motivation to build a global company, you should think about it earlier.
I think that is very important, consideration. So, making more global, you can prepare earlier. Yeah, right. And yeah, you already talk about the team building, but and also diversity is very important.
Right.
You mentioned some great example to have some like different languages and the team members. You can make some like more global atmosphere. But
Right.
you know like even like for example from the entrepreneur perspective, it's very hard to make some diversity like in Korea. For example.
Right.
We called like a Korean like atmosphere as Galapagos Island because we don't use, for example, we don't use WhatsApp, we use Kakao.
Right.
And we don't use like Google, we use Naver. So we have a very unique Korean like a system, and also you know like hiring foreigners in Korea is not easy
Right.
to make it. So. And also, it's very hard to make some like a diversified like culture.
Right.
So, do you have any tips to make some like a more global like company culture while scaling like globally?
I think ultimately culture cannot be created; it has to be discovered, and you discover that through your employees that you hire in the organization. And so what we talk about in the book is hiring what we call entrepreneurs as an international. It is sort of a new concept out of the entrepreneurial concept. If you imagine a pyramid, at the bottom you have the agile mindset, people who are iterative, resilient, growth focused. That has given way for large organizations wanting to have these agile thinkers within their organizations, people who can navigate bureaucracy, build coalition and buy-in. So the middle layer is a company mindset. But what we say is the tip of that pyramid is a culture mindset, global mindedness, culture curiosity, that then allows these leaders or these employees to have empathy, but also understand local environments and new markets to then localize the business successfully. And I always share a great example, like Abe Smith, he leads International Zoom, very globally minded leaders. His experience was he was an English teacher in rural fishing village in Kyushu, Japan, where he gained that culture mindset in the early 90s that gave him the motivation and the aspiration to build a global career. Then he actually worked for a bagel company. Yes, I'm saying bagels as in eating bagels in the East Coast that he helped grow and scale, but then expand to Japan. He saw the opportunity for that product in Japan. So he had gained that agile mindset, the builder's mentality. But then later he joined Cision, WebEx, and Cisco, massive, large organizations where he gained that company mindset, learned and understand how to navigate organizational bureaucracy and complexity to then build coalition and buy-in. And then now he leads arguably, international for one of the fast-growing companies in the world. So these are learned experiences through different experiences that he had over his career. And even you had the culture mindset as well, having lived in Chile. We actually found out we both have lived in Chile.
Yeah,
and
I was an
Santiago.
exchange student in Chile for 2005, so it's quite a long time, but yeah, we have a mutual like experience.
And that is what we call formative experiences. And I truly believe that that is something that has to be focused on in Korea. You have to build these programs at universities, so you build these formative experiences as a young talent.
Yeah, that's great. So this is a little bit controversial like question, but
Oh, I like controversy.
because of like in such economic states, like nowadays, if some like startups they want to make some like a global expansion, but somehow it is quite difficult to make some global difficult.
Right.
So someone says, "Oh, it's not a good time to go to global."
Right.
Do you agree that it is not a bad time? It is a bad time to go global now.
Well, you can see it as a risk. You could also see it as an opportunity. I spoke to someone that led international for a big big beverage company, and it's one of the biggest. It starts with a P. I'm not going to mention the full name. You can imagine what it is. But he led international, and his budget went from several millions of dollars to zero, and he got fired. So there's a lot of companies that are pulling back when it comes to international. But you can also see it as an opportunity. So a company called Kavak, which is in Mexico, they're basically a logistics platform, and they have raised a lot of money, obviously, so they have capital to invest into this area. But they recently announced that they are going to be investing $200 million in global expansion. So I think for companies that understand how to actually expand to new markets and find product market fit and can prove scale, if you already learned that muscle, I think certainly it's an opportunity, because also what you're seeing is other companies and competitors are pulling back. So while other people are pulling back, you can push forward and gain market share. So obviously, depending on your situation, you can see it as a risk or an opportunity. In my view, it's certainly an opportunity as well.
Thank you. And we talk about a little bit like in the backstage between the balance between localization and globalization. So do you think is there any kind of a rule between the two things?
That's very challenging in terms of. So what we discuss in the book is the balance between localization and complexity, right? And that's a very difficult discussion to have, and you need to figure out as a leadership team where you put up the guardrails. And so in our book, we developed what we call a localization premium analysis tool, where you benchmark, the discoveries that you find in a new market against your initial market validated business model. And so you have to figure out where you put up those guardrails. Where do you not want to change in your product? Do you not want to stand up a new tech stack when you go into a new market because it's required? For example, in Germany, citizens' data has to stay within Germany. That's a lot of cost, a lot of capital. Do we want to invest into that right now? And so ultimately, as an organization, you have to figure out what areas do you want to standardize versus where do you allow for that localization. And that is, there's not one right answer to it. It's really just a leadership discussion that you need to have in the organization.
I see. Thank you. And I've heard that you have visited to Korea multiple times lately, right? So, and also you met a great numbers of Korean startups, entrepreneurs as well. So, do you think we have any kind of a typical characters in our entrepreneurship from your international global perspective?
Well, first and foremost, Korea there's a lot of potential. Great technology is being developed in Korea, but I think it is a little bit that global mindset that's lacking a little bit, and that tendency to hard code your business around this market, focusing on Korea, scaling Korea, and then focusing on it later. There's a little bit that tendency from having coached a lot of entrepreneurs to think that the success in the Korean market can be directly translated to international markets, and the reality is no.
Right.
You have to revisit customer discovery and customer development to understand how you need to adapt that business model in that new market you want to explore to then be successful. And oftentimes I've heard the scenario where they always say the headquarter, the leadership team, the CEO tells me to do this, and he doesn't listen to me because I'm saying this is the better strategy. And so that is going into the topic of granting autonomy and trust to that local team because they're the experts in the local market. Obviously, based on those findings, you also then have to align with corporate strategy. But I rarely find Korean businesses having a little bit that approach. You have to trust that local team, give that autonomy, because ultimately they're doing the findings at a local level.
I feel I'm very agree with you because I have a same experience with that. At the first time, I couldn't understand very well why they didn't do this.
Right.
Yeah, because we always have some a little bit guidelines, and then we gave them, and then we always have some a deadline. But yeah, it never happened to make the business better. Yeah, so I think that localization, rediscovering customers and like a market needs,
Right.
yeah, is a very important for making like business globally.
It is that push and pull between headquarter and
Right.
local teams, and they're very, very challenging, right?
Right.
And part of how you can change that mindset from the
Mm-hmm.
leadership team is exposing that leadership team to the local market.
Mm-hmm.
So we spoke to a guy called Masami Takahashi, which is a Japanese person that lived around the world, but he got hired by Uber and WeWork to lead expansion into Japan. He said the number one thing and your number one role as a local leader that drives an expansion is make the leadership fall in love with your country. Because if you make them fall in love with the country, you'll be able to convince them to do certain things. You'll be able to get investments and get resources for expansion efforts. So it's really about exposure, visibility, and helping them understand what is happening there. And a great example of sort of a localization discovery, sort of a tour, if you will, is Brian Chesky from Airbnb. When he came to Korea, actually the leadership team or the local team brought him to Korea. They basically were looking at users using the application through a one-way mirror. So he was very curious to understand how local Korean users were using the app, to understand how they needed to adapt that application to successfully drive growth in Korea. So again, bringing the leader in, having that person be a part of the discovery process can be transformational and also change your ability to actually successfully scale in the market.
So you also bring your book, and for some audience who have no opportunity to read your book,
Right.
So I think you can share a little bit about a typical like mistake to making some like a global.
Sure.
So yeah, from some, for example, like if you make some like ideal cases where like a global scaling companies, they also making like mistakes, right?
Right,
So
right.
can you share those things?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. We in the beginning of our book we talk about Walmart as an example, massive company, very obviously known to the world, big retailer, were a market leader in the U.S. before they started to expand internationally. A little bit that story of hard coding your business, and so when they started to finally think about internationalization and expanding the company, they thought about expanding to Germany as a market. And as a company, they did really successfully do localization discovery in understanding how they needed to adapt the business model. Because what they focused on was a value proposition of low prices in the market, because that's what Walmart were known for in the US. They also focused on prepackaged goods in Germany, which was successful in the US. And then also they focused on keeping the culture of Walmart, where greeters stand in the front door of Walmart and say hi to people coming into the store. But the reality is, in Germany, low prices was the norm, so it was not a differentiator at all. And also the reality is that German consumers was much more accustomed to actually see the meat and seeing being cut by the butcher, so that didn't resonate either. And then thirdly, in Germany, you like to move around the store by yourself and not be interrupted, right? It actually freaks German consumers out and makes them very uncomfortable. So that didn't work either. In the process of expanding, they had acquired 80 outlets, and they had to sell off all the outlets and leave the market, and lost $1 billion in the process. So they lost a lot of time and money in that process because they didn't successfully localize the business. They didn't do that due diligence. They didn't do the localization discovery as we talk about in the book. Secondly, we share the story of Uber, who obviously is a known company around the world, and in many markets they actually failed. And part of the reason why was because they were very disruptive in their approach of expansion. It worked in the US market, disrupting the cab industry, and it took the same sort of disruptive approach when they went to Japan and other markets, and that left a lot of scorched earth and burned a lot of bridges to the government that then put regulation on top of the platform, and then they simply couldn't successfully operate. So instead, we have to have that empathy when we actually go into new markets, instead of just thinking about disruption. Disruption can be good early on as you build your business, but certainly when you expand the business internationally, you have to be much more empathetic to the local ecosystem.
Wow, that's great examples we can like learn about. some like failures.
Right. I can
So-
also share a success story if you want me to share that as well.
Oh, that's great. Can you make some like examples of who are not known company,
Right.
but you know, like in Korea, we have so many I think that most of the audience they are startups, CEOs
Right.
or like startups people. So you can make some like a small size like business companies make some like this like failure.
Right,
So
right.
you give some like tips.
But most of these companies were actually smaller, so that's where
Right,
the
right,
stories
right,
are
right.
from, right? So, and I'd like to share the story of DocuSign. DocuSign is a signature platform, right? And they were scaling or trying to expand into Japan, and they could have taken that uber disruptive approach, saying signatures is the future, and in Japan they use Hanko stamps.
Right.
You know, wooden pieces that you stamp on the piece of paper. That's the way you sign documents in a business setting. But instead, they actually partner with the local Hanko stamp maker called Shachihata that makes the physical Hanko stamps. It's not digital at all. They created a digital Hanko stamp and then shared a part of the economics with that Hanko stamp maker, and then they scaled into Japan. They showed that cultural empathy, that understanding of local norms and how you do business, and then they localized the product to successfully scale. And also, they didn't disrupt an existing company that was there. They actually partner with them. They understand that that's very important in Japan. So again, entrepreneurial leaders are important because they will help drive success in the future for your businesses.
I would like to share my mistake as well.
Oh, I love that.
During my Noom, so we make our product's name is Noom Diet Coach, and then in Korea, like a coaching concept, everybody we have a coaching concept is kind of, some like teachers make some like a diet, food guideline, and also the personal training. So we can give some all the like a secret recipe at the first, and then we can just follow. But in the US, like a coaching concept is making some like feedback, and then doing something by themselves, but giving a great like a feedback.
Right.
So the consumer's expectation is a little bit different. And also in Germany, diet is for like a patients. So not the 20s and 30s who are our target.
Right.
They don't use our app, but 50s and 60s,
Oh, wow.
like the older, they use our apps. So we at the first time we think about why this has happened, but we didn't know that. But we like later then we caught that we should rename our service
Right.
to make our like targets understand our product. So that is one of our mistake we had before.
That was a different type of user that actually appreciated the platform, maybe resonated with the value proposition that you guys had. There's another story. I spoke to one of the. This was a girl. She helped localization for Uber in Europe, and they actually found out that the majority of their users in Poland were Russian people. It was not Polish people.
Wow.
So your user base might completely change when you enter into new markets. And you can decide whether or not it's the right thing for you to do, or if you want to fine-tune things, or whatnot. But you obviously have to figure out whether or not you need to adapt your value proposition and so forth. LinkedIn, as an example, changed the value proposition for the German and the Japanese market. Whereas in Germany, you don't transition in jobs as much, and neither do you do in Japan. And so instead of focusing on hiring, they focused on learning and development, getting better at your current job. So obviously on the platform, they were putting on the learning and development products onto the platform instead of hiring and getting a job. So that's the way that they localized and they recognized that, okay, hey, we need to adapt the business to successfully scale, but also resonate with local consumers.
Great. Oh, it's already we passed like 30 minutes. So we have like just 1 minute left. So if you have any questions, yeah. Oh, there's a question. Yeah, you have some like opportunity to have some like a book as a gift. So yeah, please.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Hyemin. I'm from WeFlow, and I have two questions for you.
Oh, wow.
One, you did suggest that we have a lot of languages in office, right? And I was wondering if there's any other languages you would like to suggest other than English and Chinese, the main ones. And the second question is, you mentioned that when we scale up internationally, there's a lot of things that we need to consider. And I was wondering if you could give us some tips, a little bit more specific on what kind of support we should be reaching out for,
Sure.
and where we should be reaching out for those kind of help and support.
Sure. I think languages will obviously depend a little bit on the vision of the company, where you want to go. To give you an example, BlaBlaCar is a French company, a long distance car sharing platform. French company, and so they thought very global early on, and they thought about the concept of building for two markets. Since it's long distance car sharing, they thought about the Spanish market as being a potential market for them to expand to. And so what they actually did was that they started to hire Spanish-speaking people into the organization a year before they expanded to Spain. They're very intentional around their talent acquisition strategy to bring them into the organization, so they learned the company and the culture, and then they later used their local expertise for expansion, right? So that was the Spanish language that they needed to then expand successfully into that country. So again, it depends a little bit in terms of what opportunities you're eyeing around the world, right? So for example, if India was an interesting market for you to explore, maybe you should think about hiring people from that country, right? Anyways, second question was, I forget.
So secondly, I was asking if there's any support
Right.
that we could be reaching out for, even if we don't know what market we're exactly looking for at the moment, if there's anything that we can ask or
Right.
reach out to.
I mean, in my opinion, when you build a company, you should hire for diversity. You should not just hardcore your business around the Korean market, hiring Korean market. You should find these entrepreneurs, these international-minded people from all over the world, and build an international mix into the organization. Because then you have eyes and ears to around the world. They see opportunities that you may not see. So I wish I could tell the story of the conversation I had the other day, but I think it gives you the opportunity to truly understand, okay, how can this product resonate with other consumers in other countries? So I think it's really building a unique international-minded team from other countries, so you have the eyes to other markets as well. And support, you should think about the internal capabilities you can build in your organization, aside from building teams. Building support structures is also important. So in the book, we talk about building what we call a localization resource team, either a shared resource or a dedicated resource, depending on where you are in your scaling efforts. But you need to build these structures so your local teams know where to go when they want to ask for changes in your product, get support from HR, whatever that is within the organization, so they don't have to navigate all these things themselves from Australia to Korea. So sometimes it's good to build these structures already before you start to expand. Hopefully that answered your question.
네. 시간 관계상 여기까지 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 좋은 말씀 전해주신 패널분들께 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.